Abigail Harper sat down on the steps of that porch and did not beg. She did not weep. She simply opened the worn cloth sack she carried and pulled out the last thing she owned that was worth anything. A small iron skillet scratched and blackened from years of use, and set it on her knees like a woman who had already decided that if nobody gave her a chance today, she would cook her own supper on the side of the road and keep walking. She had been turned away from 4 jobs in 6 days. Not because her references were poor, not because she couldn't cook or clean or manage a house from floor to rafter. She had been turned away because of the way she looked. Because her body was large and her dress was plain, and the women of every household she'd visited had looked her up and down and found some quiet reason to say no. If you have ever been told without a single word spoken aloud that you are simply too much of something and not enough of everything else, then you already know exactly how Abigail Harper felt sitting on that porch in the summer heat of 1887. And if this story speaks to something deep inside you, I want you to hit that subscribe button right now and drop the name of your city in the comments below, because I want to know how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that porch in Montana and find out what happens when the wrong woman for the job turns out to be the only one who could save an entire family. The general store at the edge of Ridgeline, Montana, was not much to look at. It was the kind of place where the floorboards creaked under your boots, and the smell of tobacco and dried leather hit you before you even pushed through the door. 3 old men played cards at a table near the window every single afternoon, and they had strong opinions about everything. The weather, the price of grain, the character of every person who passed through, and they expressed those opinions loudly and without apology. Caleb Mercer heard them before he even tied his horse to the post. "That woman's been sitting on that porch since this morning?" one of the men said, not bothering to lower his voice. Hargrove's wife took one look at her and sent her packing. Said she didn't want somebody that size working in her kitchen. "Can't say I blame her," another one muttered. "Woman like that, she'd eat you out of house and home before the first frost." Low laughter, the scraping of a chair. Caleb stepped past them without a word, bought what he came for. Salt coffee, a length of rope, and paid without making eye contact with anyone. He was not in the mood. He was never in the mood if he was being honest, not anymore. He had driven the 30 miles into Ridgeline because the ranch needed supplies, and because staying on that silent property 1 more hour without a reason to leave would have swallowed him whole. He pushed back out through the door and stopped. She was sitting on the top porch step with an iron skillet across her knees and a suitcase beside her that had seen better days. Her dress was brown, and her shoes were worn, and her dark hair was pinned back neatly in a way that suggested she had taken care with her appearance, even on a day that had clearly given her nothing to feel proud about. She was a heavy-set woman, wide-shouldered and solid, with hands that rested still and patient in her lap, even though her jaw was set in the particular way of someone working hard not to let anything show. She did not look up at him. Caleb stood there for a moment longer than he meant to. "You the woman looking for work?" he asked. She looked up then. Her eyes were dark brown, and there was a steadiness in them that caught him off guard. Not the desperate pleading he'd expected, not the careful performance of someone trying to make themselves smaller. Just a direct level look that said she had been asked questions like this before, and had learned exactly how much hope to allow herself. "I am," she said. "My name is Abigail Harper. I cook, I clean, I manage a household. I can tend a kitchen garden, and I know how to keep accounts if that's needed. I have 3 letters of reference in this bag, and I'll let them speak for me." "What happened to your last position?" A pause. Brief but real. "The family I worked for moved east to be near their daughter," she said. "They gave me a good letter. Before that I worked 4 years for a widower in Billings until he passed. Before that 2 years for a ranch family in Wyoming." She kept her voice even. "I'm not looking for charity, sir. I'm looking for work." Caleb shifted the salt sack in his grip. He was 36 years old, and the last 3 years had put lines on his face that hadn't been there before. His mother had died in the spring of 1884, and his younger brother Thomas had been killed in a riding accident the following winter, and his father Samuel had taken both losses and folded inward like a man who had simply decided that the world no longer had anything left to offer him. Samuel Mercer had not eaten at the family table in almost 3 years. He had not come out of his bedroom on most days. The ranch hands did what they could. Caleb did everything else. And somewhere in between the grief and the work and the exhaustion, the house itself had gone quiet in a way that felt permanent. He needed a housekeeper. He needed someone to cook and manage the domestic side of things, because he had been failing at it since before he could admit it to himself. He had told himself he'd find someone when the time was right. He was not sure the time was ever going to feel right. "How long you been sitting out here?" he asked. "Since 8:30 this morning," Abigail said. She did not add anything to that. She did not explain or defend or make him feel guilty about the fact that it was now nearly 3 in the afternoon. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. From inside, through the warped glass of the store window, he could see one of the old card players watching with idle amusement. "You got any complaints about working out on a mountain ranch?" he said. "It's a good 30 miles from town. We don't see many visitors." "I don't require visitors," she said. "My father lives with me. He's not well. He keeps to himself." "I understand. The men who work the ranch are decent, but they're rough. You'd be the only woman on the property." "I've managed that before." Caleb set the salt sack down on the step beside her, reached into his coat pocket, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He turned it over in his hand once, then put it back. "My name is Caleb Mercer," he said. "Mercer Ranch, up on the north slope, past the Gallatin Ridge. Room and board included $3 a week to start. If things work out, we revisit the number after the first month." He paused. "I've got a wagon out back. If you're willing, I'd like to head out before the sun starts dropping." Abigail looked at him with that same steady, measuring look. "Yes," she said. "I'm willing." She stood. She picked up her suitcase without waiting for him to offer help. She picked up the iron skillet, too, tucked it under her arm like it was the most natural thing in the world, and followed him around the side of the building toward the wagon. Behind them, through the store window, one of the old men shook his head. "That fat stranger won't last a week up there," he said. "You watch." The other one scratched his chin. Mercer must be desperate. Must be. The first one agreed, and they went back to their cards. Neither of them considered even for a moment that they might be wrong. The drive out to the ranch took the better part of 2 hours, and for most of it neither Caleb nor Abigail spoke. The road climbed steadily, cutting through pine and open meadow, and the summer light came flat and gold through the trees. Caleb kept his eyes on the horses. Abigail sat with her suitcase at her feet and her hands folded in her lap, and watched the mountains like someone seeing them for the first time, which she was. "You're not from Montana," Caleb said eventually. "Ohio," she said. "Originally. I've been moving west for about 7 years." "Any family back east?" A brief silence. "No." He didn't push. He understood what that particular no contained. "The house is going to need some work," he said instead, which was an understatement significant enough that he felt a small pang of shame saying it. "I've kept up with the outside, the fences, the barn, the livestock. Inside the house, I haven't been—" He stopped. "I've been focused elsewhere." "That's all right," Abigail said. "It's worse than all right," he said flatly. "I want to be honest with you about what you're walking into." She turned to look at him. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I have walked into a house where a man hadn't left his bedroom in 2 years, and his adult children were eating cold beans out of the can for supper because nobody had the heart to cook a real meal in the kitchen where their mother used to stand. I have walked into houses where the grief was so thick you could feel it against your skin the moment you came through the door." She paused. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel better about the state of your kitchen. I'm telling you so you understand that I'm not easily frightened." Caleb looked at her. For the first time in a long while, something that wasn't quite a smile, but was close to one, moved across the corner of his mouth. "Fair enough," he said. The ranch came into view as the road crested the ridge. The main house, a long, low structure of weathered timber with a barn and several outbuildings behind it. Fences in good repair running out in clean lines to the east and west. Cattle visit. The house itself looked like a place where someone had turned out the light and forgotten to turn it back on. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the porch and climbed down. Abigail climbed down on her own side before he could come around, suitcase in hand, and stood looking at the house. "It's a good house," she said quietly, almost to herself. "It used to be," Caleb said. She looked at him. "It still is," she said. "It just needs someone to remember that." He didn't answer. He lifted her suitcase before she could stop him. She reached for it, and he was already halfway up the porch steps and pushed the front door open with his shoulder. The interior was dim and close. Dishes stacked, but not washed. A table that had been cleared by pushing things to one end rather than putting them away. Curtains that had come loose from their hooks on one side and simply been left. A wood stove that was cold, which in July was fine, but the ash pan underneath it hadn't been emptied in what looked like weeks. Abigail stood in the middle of the front room and turned slowly, taking it all in, the way a doctor takes in a patient, not with judgment, but with careful attention. "Which room is your father's?" she asked. Caleb nodded toward the hallway. "End of the hall, left side." "Does he know I'm coming?" "I told him I was going to find somebody to help with the house," Caleb said. He didn't object. "Did he respond at all?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "He said to make sure she could cook," he said. "Those were the first words he'd said to me in 4 days." Abigail nodded. She set her skillet down on the stovetop, opened her suitcase, and began taking out her things with the calm efficiency of a woman who had done exactly this, arrived in a new place, taken stock, begun more times than she cared to count. An apron. A small set of knives rolled in cloth. A cookbook so worn its spine had been reinforced with twine. A framed photograph she set on the windowsill, without comment. "I'll have supper ready by 6, she said. Caleb looked at the cold stove, the empty pantry shelves visible through the open door. "You sure about that?" "What's in the root cellar?" she asked. "Some potatoes, maybe onions, a smoked ham I haven't touched." 6 o'clock, she said again, and pulled the apron strings around her waist and tied them. Caleb watched her for a moment. Then he picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the table, put it back on his head, and went out to see to the horses. He was not a man who talked to himself. But somewhere between the barn and the water trough, he said quietly to nobody in particular, "Huh." At 5 minutes past 6, he came back inside. The kitchen was warm. There was bread on the table, actual bread, baked and set to cool on a cloth, along with a pot of bean soup thick enough to stand a spoon in, and sliced ham that had been pan-fried until the edges crisped. A crock of butter, a pitcher of water. The ash pan had been emptied. The table had been properly cleared. Caleb stood in the doorway and took it in. Abigail was at the stove with her back to him, stirring something in a smaller pot. She had found the coffee, apparently. The smell of it filled the room in a way that made the whole house feel for one disorienting moment like a different place than it had been that morning. "Miss Harper," he said. "Mr. Mercer." She didn't turn around. "Sit down. It's ready." He sat. A moment later, she set a bowl in front of him, then one at his father's usual place at the head of the table, then one at her own spot, because that was apparently how it was going to be, meals taken together, which he had not specified, but which struck him suddenly as correct. She set a small covered plate on a tray and carried it down the hall without explanation. He heard her knock on his father's door, 3 soft, even knocks, and then the quiet sound of the tray being set down outside it. She came back, sat down, and unfolded her napkin. "Shall we?" she said. Caleb looked at the place set for his father at the head of the table, empty as it always was. He looked at his own bowl. He looked at Abigail, who was already eating with the composed, unhurried manner of someone who expected nothing dramatic tonight, and was content with that. He picked up his spoon. It was the best meal he had eaten in 3 years. He didn't say so. He didn't need to. What he did was finish every bite, refill his bowl, once eat 2 pieces of bread, and drink 2 cups of coffee. And when he finally set down his spoon and leaned back in his chair, the kitchen was quiet, in a way that was entirely different from the silence that had been there all day. This silence had something in it. Not much. Just the smallest beginning of something. But Caleb Mercer, who had spent 3 years learning the particular weight of an empty house, noticed the difference. The way you notice when a headache that's been with you so long, you've forgotten it was there, has without announcement simply gone. He looked across the table at Abigail Harper, who was clearing her place with calm efficiency, and he thought, though he wouldn't have been able to say exactly what he meant by it, that he had perhaps made one right decision today, in a stretch of days that had not had many. Down the hall beyond the closed door at the end, a tray sat outside his father's room. It was empty, every bite gone. Caleb saw it when he walked past on his way to bed, and he stopped in the hallway and stood there for a long moment, staring at that empty plate in the lamplight, and something moved in his chest that he had no name for. He turned off the lamp. He went to bed. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he fell asleep before midnight. The empty tray was still on Caleb's mind when he came down to breakfast the next morning. He hadn't slept well, not because anything was wrong, but because something was different, and his body hadn't caught up with what his mind was still trying to work out. The house felt different in the dark. Not warmer exactly, just less empty. Like the difference between a room where a candle has been burning and one where it's only just been blown out, you can still feel the heat if you stand close enough. Abigail was already in the kitchen when he came down. She had the fire going in the stove and a pot of oats on, and she was standing at the counter, cutting dried apple slices into a small bowl with the quiet, focused manner of someone who had been awake for a while and had already made peace with the morning. "You sleep all right?" Caleb asked. "Fine," she said without turning. "Room's comfortable, thank you." He poured himself coffee from the pot she'd already set on the back of the stove and leaned against the counter. Outside, he could hear one of the ranch hands crossing the yard boots on dry ground, the distant sound of a horse in the barn being restless about something. "My father's tray," he said. "I saw," she said. "He hasn't eaten a full meal outside his room in almost 3 years." Abigail was quiet for a moment, working the knife through the dried apple in small, even cuts. "Well," she said, "he ate last night." "I know he did." "Then let's not make it strange," she said simply, and tipped the apple into the pot. Caleb looked at her. There was something in the steadiness of her that he couldn't quite categorize, not indifference, and not the careful performance of someone trying to seem unaffected. Just a kind of patient practicality that didn't need the moment to be larger than it was. He had spent the last 3 years watching everyone around him treat his father like a man made of glass. Neighbors who came by stopped speaking too loudly the moment they came through the door. The ranch hands talked around Samuel Mercer the way you talk around a bruise. Even Caleb himself had started doing it, adjusting, softening, tiptoeing around the edges of his own house. Abigail Harper had been here less than 24 hours, and she was cutting apple slices into the oatmeal. "I'm going to put a tray outside his door again this morning," she said. "Same time as yesterday. 3 knocks, same as last night." "He might not take it." "He might not," she agreed. "That's all right." She said it like it genuinely was all right, not a problem, not a failure waiting to happen. Caleb drank his coffee and didn't say anything else. She set the tray outside Samuel's door at 7:30, knocked 3 times, and walked away. By the time Caleb came back in from the morning chores 2 hours later, the tray was gone. Not empty on the floor outside the door. Gone pulled inside. Which meant Samuel had opened the door wide enough to bring it in, which was more movement than Caleb had seen from his father's room in weeks. He stood in the hallway and stared at the empty floor outside that closed door for long enough that one of the ranch hands, a lean, sun-weathered man named Pete Harlow, who'd worked the Mercer property for 6 years, came looking for him and found him standing there like he'd forgotten what he was doing. "Boss," Pete said. "He took the tray inside," Caleb said. Pete looked at the floor, then at Caleb, then back at the floor. "Huh," he said. "Yeah," Caleb said. They stood there together for another moment. 2 grown men standing in a hallway being quietly undone by an empty patch of floor, and then Caleb cleared his throat and put his hat back on, and went back outside, because there was work to do, and he didn't know what else to do with what he was feeling. In the kitchen, Abigail had already started on the curtain in the front room that had been hanging loose from its hook, for Caleb tried to remember probably 8 months. She was standing on a chair to reach the rod, rehooking the fabric with the calm efficiency of someone who didn't need to be thanked for fixing a thing and wasn't expecting to be. "You don't have to do that," Caleb said from the doorway. "I know," she said. She fixed the last hook and climbed down from the chair and stood back to look at it. "You have a needle and thread anywhere, there's a tear in the bottom hem of this one." "Kitchen drawer," he said. "Left side." She nodded and went to find it. Caleb looked at the curtain hanging straight now, the morning light coming through the window in a clean, even fall of gold across the floor. His mother had made those curtains. Yellow cotton with small white flowers along the border. He had not looked at them directly in a long time, because looking at them directly had been something he couldn't do. But right now, with the fabric hanging the way it was supposed to hang, they looked like curtains instead of like a wound. He went back outside before Abigail came back with the needle and thread. He wasn't ready to explain that yet. The days that followed moved the way summer days on a working ranch always do, long and physical, and full of small problems that required immediate attention and left no room for introspection. Caleb was up before 5 every morning. He was rarely inside before dark. The cattle needed moving to new grazing ground. A section of fence on the north quarter had failed overnight and needed replacing before the herd found it. One of the horses had thrown a shoe and was limping badly enough to call for the farrier who wouldn't be out from town until Thursday. But every morning at 7:30, a tray appeared outside Samuel Mercer's door, and every morning it disappeared. By the 4th day, Pete Harlow mentioned it to the other 2 hands, a young man named Denny, who couldn't have been more than 20, and kept his hat brim pulled low, and a quiet older fellow called Walt, who spoke rarely, and when he did said things that tended to be worth listening to. "That new woman," Pete said at the breakfast table in the bunkhouse, "she's been feeding the old man every morning." "He taking it?" Walt asked. "Every bit," Pete said. Denny looked up from his plate. "Mr. Mercer Sr., he actually eating?" "Every bit," Pete said again. Walt considered this. He had a way of chewing over information, the way he chewed his food deliberately without hurry. "She know what she's doing," he said finally. "Seems like—" Pete agreed. By the end of the first week, Abigail had reorganized the kitchen from top to bottom. Not because Caleb asked her to, he hadn't, but because a disorganized kitchen was inefficient, and she was not a woman who tolerated inefficiency in her own domain. She moved the dry goods to a consistent order on the shelves. She found a cache of preserving jars in the cellar that hadn't been touched in 2 years and brought them up. She discovered that someone she suspected Caleb, though she didn't ask, had been buying coffee in sufficient quantity for 3 times the people who actually lived in the house, which told her something about the kind of man he was, without needing to say it aloud. She also discovered, tucked in the back of the pantry behind a rusted tin of baking powder, a handwritten recipe book in a woman's careful cursive. She took it out and set it on the counter and opened it to the first page. Clara Mercer, 1869. She stood there for a moment with her hand flat on the open page. Then she closed it gently, tied the loose pages back together with the ribbon that had been keeping them from scattering, and set it in the place of honor it deserved, top shelf, where the light from the window would reach it, but the cooking steam wouldn't. She did not mention it to Caleb, but the next morning the oatmeal had dried apple and a pinch of cinnamon in it, the same way Clara Mercer had written it in 1869. And when Caleb tasted it and went very still for just a moment before he kept eating, Abigail said nothing. She just poured his coffee and sat down across from him and let the moment be whatever it was. The ranch hands started eating at the main house by the 2nd week. This was not Abigail's idea exactly. It happened the way things happen when someone is cooking food that smells like it belongs to a real home, and the bunkhouse kitchen produces only the indifferent results of men cooking for men who don't much care what they eat, as long as it fills the space. Pete appeared at the back door one evening with his hat in his hands and asked if it would be an imposition. Abigail said, "Wash your hands first," and handed him a stack of plates to set on the table. From that evening on, supper at the Mercer Ranch was a full table affair. Pete, Denny, Walt, and Caleb with a covered tray set aside for Samuel and another empty chair at the table that nobody sat in, but that nobody suggested removing either. It was Denny who said one evening near the end of the second week what all four of them had been thinking. "Ma'am," he said, looking at his plate with the particular reverence of a young man who has just eaten the best meal of his recent life. "If you don't mind me saying, this is the first time I've sat at a table that felt like supper since I left home." Abigail looked at him. He was young, 20 at most, probably less, with the ranginess of someone still growing into his own height, and the look of a boy who had left something behind him and was still figuring out how to be without it. "Where's home?" she asked. "Kansas," he said. "My mother's still there." "Write her," Abigail said. He blinked. "Ma'am." "Write your mother," she said again. "Tonight before you go to sleep. Don't wait until you have something important to say. Just write her." Denny looked at his plate. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. Walt across the table caught Caleb's eye for just a fraction of a second. Caleb looked back at his food. Pete cleared his throat. "Mighty fine stew, Miss Harper," he said. "Thank you, Pete," she said, and got up to bring more bread. It was 10 days into her time at the ranch that Samuel Mercer opened his bedroom door while Abigail was in the hallway. She had been carrying a basket of folded laundry toward the linen closet, moving quietly the way she always did in that end of the house, when the door at the end of the hall opened and a man stepped out who she had not yet seen. He was perhaps 60, lean in the way of men who have lost weight. They weren't trying to lose with Caleb's same strong jaw, but eyes that had been somewhere far away for a long time and hadn't quite come all the way back. He saw her and stopped. She stopped too. They stood there in the hallway with a basket of laundry between them and 3 weeks of breakfast trays behind them and looked at each other. "You must be Mr. Mercer," Abigail said. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. His eyes moved over her, not unkindly, just carefully, the way you look at something you've been hearing about without seeing. "You're the one been leaving the food," he said. His voice was rough from disuse. "Yes, sir." "Oatmeal with the cinnamon apple," he said. "Yes, sir." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, not quite, but the place where one might eventually be. "Clara used to make it that way," he said. "I know," Abigail said quietly. She wrote it down. Samuel looked at her for another long moment. His jaw worked like he was trying to find something and couldn't quite land on it. Then he said, "Supper at 6. "Yes, sir." He nodded once. "All right," he said, and went back inside and closed the door. Abigail stood in the hallway holding her laundry basket and let out a slow, quiet breath. She did not go tell Caleb. She put the laundry away and went back to the kitchen and started on supper. At 6 o'clock, Caleb came through the back door and stopped dead in the kitchen doorway. His father was sitting at the head of the table, not in the hallway, not invisible behind a closed door. At the head of the Mercer family table where Samuel Mercer had sat every night for 30 years before grief had taken him out of the world. He was sitting straight, and his hands were on the table, and he was looking at nothing in particular, but he was there actually physically, undeniably there. Caleb's hand was still on the doorframe. "Dad," he said. The word came out of him like something he'd been holding underwater. Samuel looked at him. "Son," he said. "Sit down. Food's getting cold." Caleb sat down. Pete and Denny and Walt came in behind him and stopped in the same sequence, one beat of stunned stillness, then the rapid adjustment of men who understood that something important was happening and that the right thing to do was act normal. Pete pulled out his chair. Denny knocked his elbow on the doorframe, trying to get past Walt. Walt moved with the considered calm of a man who had learned a long time ago that some things were better absorbed quietly. Abigail set the serving bowls on the table and sat down in her own spot and looked at nobody in particular. Caleb watched his father reach for the bread. He watched Samuel tear a piece, butter it, and eat it with the uncomplicated manner of a man who was simply hungry and had decided to be hungry somewhere other than behind a closed door. Something happened in Caleb's chest that he could not have named and would not have tried to. He reached for his hand was not entirely steady. Under the table, out of sight of everyone, Abigail's hands were clasped tightly together in her lap. Because she knew better than anyone that this moment, this first supper, this careful return was fragile in the way of all first things. And she wanted it to hold. She wanted it so badly that her throat was tight with it, and she had to work at her composure the way she always had to work at it, the way she'd learned to over years of caring for people in broken places and knowing that her own feelings were not the point. The meal was a roast chicken with potatoes and green beans from the kitchen garden she'd been tending behind the house, and a pan gravy she'd built from the drippings, and the bread she'd put up that morning. It was the kind of meal that didn't announce itself. It just was solid and warm and exactly right for a table of people who hadn't sat around one together in a very long time. Samuel ate every bite. Afterward, when Pete and Denny and Walt had gone back to the bunkhouse and Caleb was finishing his second cup of coffee, Samuel sat in his chair at the head of the table and said without preamble, "She's good." Caleb looked up. "The woman?" Samuel said. "She's good." "I know," Caleb said. "Clara would have liked her," Samuel said. Caleb didn't answer right away. He looked down at his coffee cup. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think she would have." Samuel pushed himself up from the table slowly, one hand on the chair back. He was steadier than Caleb expected. He was steadier than he'd been in 3 years. He shuffled toward the hallway and then stopped one hand on the wall and turned back. "Tell her," he said, "the chicken was right." Caleb looked at him. The chicken was right. "Clara had a saying," Samuel said. "If the chicken's right, the cook's honest. Means she didn't cut corners." He looked down the hallway for a moment. "Clara's chicken was always right." He paused. "Tell the woman." He went down the hallway. The door at the end of it closed. Caleb sat at the table for another minute. Then he got up and went to the back porch where Abigail was sitting on the step in the evening air with a cup of tea cooling between her hands, looking at the dark outline of the mountains against the last gray light. "My father says the chicken was right," he said. Abigail looked up at him. He could see even in the low light the moment she understood what he meant, how it moved through her face, and was then immediately and carefully contained the way she contained everything that mattered too much. "Did he?" she said. "Said if the chicken's right, the cook's honest," Caleb said. "Said it was Clara's saying." Abigail was quiet for a moment. She looked back at the mountains. "That's about the finest thing anyone said to me," she said quietly. Caleb leaned against the porch post. "You found the recipe book." It wasn't a question. She didn't pretend it was. "Yes," she said. "It was in the pantry. I hope that was all right." "It's more than all right," he said. "I didn't even know it was there." She turned her teacup slowly in her hands. "She kept beautiful records," Abigail said. "Your mother. Every dish with notes. Little things not enough salt the first time, try more butter the second. The kind of notes you write when you care about getting it right." Caleb didn't say anything. He looked at the sky. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman," Abigail said. "She was," he said. The quiet that fell between them after that was the kind that didn't need filling. It had texture and weight, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that two people can share when they've been honest with each other about something real without having to make a speech about it. After a while, Abigail said, "I'd better get inside. Long day tomorrow." "Yeah," Caleb said. He straightened. "Miss Harper." She was already at the door. She turned. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it. The tray every morning and the curtain and the—" He stopped. He was not a man who was good at this. Just, "Thank you." Abigail looked at him for a moment. "It's what I'm here for," she said quietly. And then she went inside. Caleb stood on the porch for another minute in the dark. He was not sure that was entirely true anymore. He wasn't sure it had been true for a while. But he didn't know what else to call it, and he was not ready to call it anything else yet, so he left it where it was and went inside. 3 weeks into Abigail's time at the Mercer Ranch, the town of Ridgeline had opinions. This was not surprising. The town of Ridgeline always had opinions. But the specific opinions it had about Caleb Mercer hiring a heavy-set unclaimed woman to run his house had a particular quality of enjoyment to them, the kind that small communities reserve for decisions made by private people who do not explain themselves. Eleanor Hatch, who owned the dry goods half of the general store with her husband, and who served as the primary information exchange node for the entire valley, expressed the consensus view with characteristic efficiency one afternoon when Caleb came in for supplies. "I'll say this for you, Caleb Mercer," she announced, not bothering to lower her voice despite 2 other customers being in the room. "You are a man with strong nerves hiring that woman." Caleb put a sack of flour on the counter. "Flour," he said. 20 pounds, and whatever you've got in the way of dried cherries." "I'm only saying what everyone else is saying," Eleanor continued. "Woman like that, no people, no history in this county, not exactly what you'd call—" She paused, searching for something she could say in mixed company, petite. "Dried cherries," Caleb said. "She won't last," Eleanor said, but she was already going to the shelf. "Come winter, she'll want the comforts of town. Mark my words." "I'll need a block of salt too," Caleb said. "And a pound of that coffee if you've got the dark roast." Eleanor brought the items with the purposeful energy of a woman who was going to make her point, regardless of whether anyone was engaging with it. "People are going to talk is all I'm saying. A bachelor ranch, 1 woman, nobody knowing where she came from. My father ate supper at the family table last Tuesday," Caleb said. Eleanor stopped. "And Wednesday," he said. "And Thursday, and every night since." He met her eyes directly. 3 years he didn't come out of that room, 1 week with Miss Harper in the house, and he's eating at the table. He put his money on the counter. I'll let that speak for itself. The store was very quiet. The 2 other customers were looking at the shelves with great concentration. Eleanor looked at Caleb for a long moment. Something moved in her face. Surprise, and then something that might have been respect if she'd allowed herself to get all the way to it. She counted out his change slowly. "Well," she said finally. "Much obliged," Caleb said, and picked up his supplies and walked out. He drove the 30 miles home with the particular satisfaction of a man who has said exactly the right number of words in exactly the right order and is not going to ruin it by saying any more. Abigail didn't know about the exchange in the store, and Caleb didn't tell her. But something shifted in the way the valley treated the Mercer Ranch. Over the following week, the shift was small, barely perceptible, the way weather changes before the change is visible in the sky. A neighboring farm wife, named Ruth Colby, came by with a jar of her preserved peaches, because she'd made too many, which was transparently an excuse, but a friendly one. The preacher's wife stopped and waved from the road when she passed. These were small things. But in a place where small things were the entire vocabulary of belonging, they were significant, Samuel noticed. He was on the porch one afternoon. He'd started coming out in the afternoons now, sitting in the old wooden chair by the front railing with a cup of coffee, not talking to anyone in particular, but being present in the world, which was enough when Ruth Colby came by with her peaches and asked after Abigail by name. "She's in the kitchen," Samuel said. "Go on around the back." Ruth thanked him and went. Samuel watched her go with the expression of a man who is quietly noting a thing in his own internal ledger. That evening at supper, he said without preamble, "People are coming around." Abigail looked up. "I noticed Mrs. Colby's visit," she said. "That was kind of her." "It's not kindness," Samuel said in the direct, unceremonious way of old men who have stopped bothering with diplomatic language. "It's curiosity and a little bit of shame. They were talking about you in town. Now they're coming to see for themselves." Abigail set down her fork. "What were they saying in town?" "Nothing you haven't heard before, I imagine," Samuel said, looking at his plate. "Nothing worth repeating to your face." Abigail held very still for a moment. Samuel. She said she'd started using his first name by the end of the first week, at his insistence in the abrupt, non-negotiable way he had of deciding things. I've been this county for a month. I expected talk. Expecting it doesn't mean it doesn't sting, he said. She looked at him. No, she said quietly. It doesn't. Samuel put down his fork and looked at her directly. The same direct, unhurried look Caleb used, the genetic inheritance of 2 generations of men who said what they meant. What they say about you is wrong, he said flatly. I want you to know that I know it. The kitchen was very quiet. Caleb across the table was looking at the bowl of green beans. Abigail looked at Samuel Mercer and held the moment for just a second longer than she needed to, because some things deserve to be felt properly before you move past them. Thank you, Samuel, she said. Don't thank me, he said. Pass the bread. She passed the bread. Caleb looked up from the green beans. He caught Abigail's eye for just a fraction of a second, a glance that held more than he was ready to say, and that she received with the same careful composure she brought to everything that mattered. Then she looked away. Then he did. Outside, the summer was still full and heavy, and the evening light was coming through the kitchen window in long, warm lines, and somewhere across the yard, Denny was whistling something tuneless and cheerful, and the sound of it mixed with the smell of fresh bread and coffee, and the quiet clink of silverware, and made the kitchen feel like the kind of place it had been built to be. Samuel reached for the bread. He ate it without speaking, without offering any further declaration. He didn't need to. He had already said everything that mattered. It was Abigail who carried his words with her long after the table was cleared, and the dishes were washed, and the house had settled into the particular quiet of a summer night. She carried them the way she had learned to carry good things carefully at a little distance, not allowing herself to hold on too tight. Because Abigail Harper had lived long enough to know that the warmth of a family's table could be taken away without warning. That caring too much, leaning in too close, allowing yourself to believe you belonged. Those were the precise coordinates of a wound she had visited before. She had learned from every house she'd ever worked in that her job was to be essential but not permanent. To fix the broken thing and then make way for the healed version without herself. She washed the last bowl and dried her hands, and stood at the kitchen window in the dark, looking at her own reflection in the glass, the wide shoulders, the full cheeks, the plain dress, and she gave herself the same instruction she had given herself every night in every house. Don't fall in love with it, she told herself. Don't fall in love with this table, and this family, and that old man who told you he knows what you're worth. Don't fall in love with the man who drives 30 miles into town and comes back with dried cherries because he remembered you'd used the last of them. She turned off the lamp above the sink. She went to bed. And the instruction she'd given herself, so practiced, so necessary, so perfectly reasonable, lasted until approximately 4 in the morning, when she woke in the dark of the small room at the back of the house and lay there, listening to the sounds of a sleeping ranch that she had already, without meaning to, begun to think of as home. She closed her eyes. She told herself she would do better tomorrow. She was not at all sure she believed it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Caleb was out on the North Quarter when Pete rode out to find him. The envelope held up in one hand like it was something that needed to be delivered before it got any heavier. It was from the Ridgeline Savings and Trust, and the return address alone was enough to put a cold edge on the morning air, even though it was still high summer, and the sun had no business making anything feel cold. Caleb read it on horseback. He read it twice. Then he folded it back along its original creases and put it in his shirt pocket and rode back to the barn without saying a word to Pete, which Pete understood well enough to not ask about. The numbers in the letter were not complicated. They did not need to be. Drought had taken the eastern grazing land down to cracked clay and stunted grass since mid-June, and the herd had been burning through the stored feed reserves at twice the projected rate. The bank had been patient. The letter was careful to say so in the way of institutions that want credit for the patience they're about to stop exercising. The note on the property was due in full by the 1st of November, or the trust would be compelled to begin foreclosure proceedings on the Mercer Ranch and all its improvements. November 1st was 11 weeks away. Caleb unsaddled his horse and put him up and stood in the barn for a while with his hands flat on the stall railing, looking at nothing. The Mercer Ranch had been his father's ranch before it was his, and his grandfather's before that. His grandfather had built the main house with timber he'd cut himself and dragged down the ridge on a sledge. His grandmother had planted the cottonwood trees along the south fence line. His mother had put in the kitchen garden and the rose beds and written her recipes in a book that was now sitting on the top shelf of the pantry, where a woman who had been here 6 weeks had placed it with more reverence than Caleb had managed in 3 years of looking past it. He could not lose this ranch. He could not lose it, and he had no immediate idea how to keep it, and both of those things were sitting on his chest with the weight of something he wasn't sure he could carry. He stayed in the barn for another 10 minutes. Then he went inside. Abigail was in the kitchen working a batch of bread dough on the floured counter with the focused, rhythmic efficiency she brought to every physical task. Her full weight behind the heels of her hands, turning and pressing, turning and pressing. She looked up when he came through the door, and whatever she saw in his face made her hands go still. "What happened?" she said. He put the letter on the counter beside the dough. She wiped her hands on her apron and picked it up. She read it without speaking, her expression doing nothing dramatic, just going through that careful, attentive stillness she used when she was taking in information she needed to fully understand before she responded to it. She set the letter back down. "How bad is the feed situation?" she asked. "Bad enough that I've been buying from Hargrove's stock at a price that makes the math ugly," he said. "If the eastern pasture doesn't come back by September, I've got maybe 6 weeks of reserves at current consumption." "And the note, $4,200, he said, "by November 1st. Abigail looked at the letter again. "Do you have anything liquid savings investments?" $1,100 in the Ridgeline account, he said. "The rest is tied up in cattle and land and improvements that the bank already knows about." Abigail was quiet for a moment. She turned back to her dough and began working it again slowly this time, thinking with her hands the way she always did when something required her full attention. What about selling part of the herd, the northern pasture cattle? At current prices, with the drought affecting the whole region, I'd get maybe 60 cents on the dollar, Caleb said. It'd cover the shortfall, but I'd be cutting the breeding stock so deep it'd take 3 years to rebuild. "But the ranch would still be standing," she said. "Yes," he said, "but barely." She pressed the heels of her hands into the dough. "Then that's what you do," she said. Caleb looked at her. "It's not that simple." "I didn't say it was simple," she said. "I said it's what you do. You don't sell the land, and you don't lose the house. Everything else can be rebuilt." She looked at him directly. "Your grandfather built this place once. You can rebuild the herd." Caleb leaned against the counter and crossed his arms. He was not by nature or by choice a man who shared his troubles easily. He had spent the last 3 years managing everything alone, partly because there was no one to share it with, and partly because sharing it would have made it more real in a way he wasn't ready for. But standing in this kitchen, with this woman who was looking at him with the unsentimental practicality of someone who had survived harder mathematics than this, he felt the particular relief of a weight that has been carried alone being acknowledged by another person. He didn't say any of that. He said, "I'm going to have to let you go." Abigail stopped working the dough. The kitchen went very quiet. "The $3 a week," he said. "The room and board on top of that. When I run the numbers." "No," she said. He blinked. "Miss Harper." "No," she said again, and turned to face him fully, her hands still floury, her expression carrying a firmness he hadn't seen from her before, not aggressive, not heated, just absolutely certain. "You will not let me go because of a bank letter, Caleb Mercer. We are not having that conversation. The finances. I will work without the salary until the note is settled," she said. "Room and board is enough, and before you tell me I can't do that, I want you to understand that I am a grown woman who has made her own decisions her entire life, and I do not need your permission to make this one." Caleb stared at her. "Furthermore, she said, turning back to the dough with the energy of someone who has made a decision and is closing the door on further discussion. I have about $47 saved that I'd like to put toward supplies so we can put up as many preserves as possible before the end of summer. It'll reduce the household food spend significantly through winter. Abigail, he said. She turned around at the use of her first name. He had not used it before, had been careful with the formal Miss Harper in the way of a man maintaining a safe distance, and the surprise of it made her go still. "You don't have to do this," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "I know I don't have to," she said quietly. "That's not why I'm doing it." The words landed between them with a weight that neither of them was quite ready to examine. Caleb held her gaze for one beat too long, then looked at the letter on the counter. He picked it up. He folded it and put it back in his pocket. "I'll think about the herd numbers tonight," he said. "All right," she said. He went back outside. Abigail stood at the kitchen counter with her hands in the bread dough and her heart going at a speed that she firmly instructed it to reduce. She had not meant to say it that way. She had meant to say something practical and clear about household economics, not something that sounded like not something that could be taken for. She pressed the dough hard and turned it. Down the hall, a door opened. She heard the slow, deliberate footsteps that she had come to recognize as Samuel's. He moved with more purpose now than he had a month ago, but still carefully, the way of a man who has been still for a long time and is relearning the simple mechanics of moving through a house. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at Abigail. He looked at the floury counter and the bread dough, and the particular quality of the silence in the room, which was the kind of silence that follows a significant conversation. He had lived in this house for 30 years. He knew its silences. "Bank letter," he said. It was not a question. Abigail looked up. "Yes." Samuel walked to the table and sat down in his chair with the deliberate ease of a man settling in for something. "How bad?" she told him. She told him the number and the date and the current state of the feed reserves, and she told him what Caleb had said about the herd prices and what she had said in response, and she told him all of it in the same even factual way she would have reported a weather forecast. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because Samuel Mercer deserved the truth in plain language. Samuel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat quietly for a moment with his hands folded on the table and his eyes on something above and behind her head. "He's going to try to do this alone," Samuel said. "Yes," Abigail said. "He is." "He's been doing everything alone for 3 years," Samuel said. "He doesn't know any other way." "I know." Samuel looked at her. "Neither do I," he said. "Used to. Then Clara died and I forgot." He paused. "What I did was wrong. Leaving him to carry all of it while I sat in that room. I know that. I knew it while I was doing it." His jaw tightened. "I just couldn't." He stopped. "I know," Abigail said quietly. "You always know," he said. There was no accusation in it, just the observation of a man who has noticed something. Abigail set the dough aside and covered it with a cloth. She sat down across from him. "Samuel," she said, "you came back. That's what matters now." He looked at his hands. "There are people in this county I haven't spoken to in 3 years who might still do business with the Mercer name," he said slowly. "Old connections. I was before Clara died. I was the one who handled the financial side. I knew people in Billings, a grazing cooperative over in the Gallatin Valley that shares feed resources during drought years. A land broker who might be interested in a temporary easement on the southeast quarter rather than a full sale." He paused. "I let all of it go to seed. But seeds don't die. They just wait." Abigail looked at him. "I need paper," he said. "And the account books. Caleb keeps them in the desk in the front room." Abigail got up without a word, went to the front room, and came back with the account ledger and a pen and a bottle of ink and 3 sheets of writing paper. She set them in front of Samuel Mercer like she was laying out surgical instruments. She did not say anything about what this meant, that this man who had not engaged with the world in 3 years was sitting at his kitchen table in his own house with a pen in his hand, ready to try. She just set the paper down and went back to her bread. Samuel uncapped the ink. He started to write. The scratch of the pen in the quiet kitchen was the loudest sound Abigail had ever heard. She kept her eyes on the dough. She shaped it. She put it in the pan. She did not cry because there was no time for that, and because the bread needed attention, and because Samuel Mercer was writing letters at the kitchen table, and some things were simply too important to interrupt with your own feelings. Caleb came in at noon and stopped in the kitchen doorway. His father was still at the table. The 3 original sheets of paper had been joined by 5 more. There were 2 letters folded and addressed sitting to Samuel's left, and a third in progress under his hand. His coffee cup was empty, and he hadn't noticed. Caleb looked at his father. He looked at Abigail, who was slicing bread at the counter, and did not look up, but said, "Gallatin Valley Cooperative, and a broker in Billings. He thinks there may be a way through that doesn't require selling the breeding stock." Caleb stood very still. "Coffee's cold," she added. "I'll make fresh." Caleb pulled out a chair and sat down at the table across from his father. Samuel didn't look up from the letter he was writing. The Gallatin Cooperative has a shared emergency feed arrangement. He said, his pen still moving. "We paid into it for 12 years before I stopped attending meetings. The credit should still be there, if Hendricks is still running it, and I suspect he is because Hendricks is too stubborn to retire, he'll honor it." Caleb watched his father's pen move across the paper. "You remember all of this," he said. "I remember everything," Samuel said. "I just stopped caring whether I remembered." He paused. "I'm sorry for that." The word fell into the room with the particular weight of something that has been a long time coming. Caleb's throat moved. "Dad." "Don't," Samuel said, not unkindly. "Let me finish this letter. We can talk about the rest of it later. Right now what matters is the ranch." Caleb put his hands flat on the table. He nodded once. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to ride into Ridgeline tomorrow and send the wire to Hendricks before the cooperative board meets on Friday," Samuel said. "And I need you to pull the deed from wherever you're keeping it so I can confirm the southeast quarter boundaries before I write to the broker." "Top drawer of the desk," Caleb said. "The blue folder." "Good." Samuel dipped his pen. "Now let me write." Abigail set fresh coffee on the table between them. 2 cups, father and son, the way it should have been for the last 3 years, and went back to the counter and sliced more bread and said nothing at all, because some things don't need commentary. Some things just need to happen while someone quietly keeps the kitchen running so the important work can get done. Pete Harlow appeared at the back door at 1:30, hat in hand, with the look of a man who has been working up to something. "I heard there might be trouble with the bank," he said. Caleb looked at him from the table. "Where'd you hear that?" "Denny heard something in town last week, and we put it together with what's been happening." Pete turned his hat in his hands. "Walt and me were talking. We'll work without pay through October if it helps. We ain't going anywhere." Caleb opened his mouth. "Don't tell us we can't," Pete said with a firmness that was almost a mirror of Abigail's that morning, which Caleb noted privately and said nothing about. "This ranch is the best place either of us has worked in 15 years. Walt says it's the first place he's eaten a proper supper since before his wife passed." Pete's jaw was set. "We're staying." Caleb looked at Pete for a long moment. Then he looked at Abigail, who was looking at the bread on the counter, with the careful composure of someone who is not going to make this harder than it needs to be by crying. "All right," Caleb said quietly. "Thank you, Pete." Pete nodded, put his hat back on, and went back out. Samuel, who had stopped writing during this exchange, dipped his pen again. "Good men," he said. "Yes," Caleb said. "Your mother always said you could tell the measure of a man's household by the loyalty of the people who worked it," Samuel said. "She'd be proud." The kitchen was quiet again. Outside, Denny started up his tuneless whistling, and the sound of it came through the window with the afternoon air, and Abigail shaped the second loaf with her hands, and thought carefully at a distance that she had been in a lot of households, and she had never been in one quite like this one. And she was very afraid of what that meant for the instruction she gave herself every night when she lay in the dark of the back bedroom and told herself not to fall in love with it. She was, it turned out, not very good at that instruction. She had known it for a while. She was only just beginning to admit it. The wire went the same day. The broker's letter went out with the Thursday post. Samuel wrote 2 additional letters to men he'd known for 20 years. Men who had eaten at the Mercer table when Clara was alive, and who Samuel believed still had enough respect for the family name to listen to a proposal before they said no. While the letters were in transit, the work of the ranch continued because it had to. Caleb moved the herd to the northwest pasture, which had held its grass better through the drought. Pete and Walt repaired the section of barn roof that had been letting in weather since spring. Denny rode fence every morning with a new energy that had something to do, Caleb suspected, with the letter to his mother in Kansas that he'd written 3 weeks ago, and the reply that had arrived unexpectedly on Monday. Abigail put up 46 jars of preserved vegetables and fruit over the course of that week. Tomatoes, green beans, peaches from Ruth Colby's trees. Ruth had shown up with 2 bushels of them after hearing through the intricate social telegraph of the valley something vague about trouble with the bank, and had said only, "Figured you could use these," and refused payment with the stubbornness of a woman who has made up her mind. Abigail had thanked her properly and spent 2 solid days at the stove. Her hands were stained with tomato, and her back ached from standing at the canning pot, and she was, in some way she couldn't have explained clearly, deeply content. Samuel sat with her on the second afternoon while she worked. He didn't help his hands weren't steady enough for the jar sealing, but he sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and talked, which was something he'd been doing more of lately. He talked about the ranch in its good years, when the herd had been 3 times the current size, and the grazing land had been lush, and the Mercer name had meant something specific and solid in this valley. He talked about the drought of 1879 and how his own father had survived it. He talked about Clara, not with the aching avoidance that Caleb still sometimes slipped into, but with the directness of a man who has made peace with grief enough to let the person be a person again rather than a wound. "She would have done exactly this," he said, watching Abigail lift a sealed jar from the hot water bath with practiced ease. "Put up enough food to survive a siege. Said the best way to fight worry was to work your hands until the worry had no room left." "That's good advice," Abigail said. She was a smart woman. He turned his coffee cup. "You remind me of her sometimes. Not in the way you look, you're your own kind of woman, but in the way you handle a room, the way a room feels different when you're in it." Abigail set the jar on the towel with the others and didn't say anything for a moment. "That is a very kind thing to say," she said finally. "It's accurate," Samuel said. "I don't say kind things. I say accurate things." He paused. "Caleb's noticed too, you know." Abigail kept her eyes on the canning pot. "Samuel," she said. "I'm old," he said. "Not blind." She turned to look at him. He met her eyes with the unblinking directness of a man who has decided he's going to say the thing and won't be redirected. "I'm an employee of this household," she said carefully. "You were an employee of this household," he said. "That changed a while ago. I'm not sure exactly when, but it did, and I think you know it." He paused. "I also think you're planning on leaving." The words hit her with a precision that she hadn't braced for. She turned back to the stove. "I've seen it before," he said quietly, without cruelty, in the tone of a man stating a fact that he finds painful but necessary. "People who are good at taking care of others have a habit of leaving before they can be left. My mother did it with friendships. Caleb does it with—" He stopped. "But that's his business." Abigail lifted another jar. Her hands were steady. She was very good at making her hands steady. "I'm not planning anything," she said. "You're thinking about it," he said. "That's the same as planning with people like you." She set the jar down. She turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at Samuel Mercer. This old man, who had come back from somewhere very far inside himself, who was sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the particular authority of someone who has earned the right to say hard things. I have been in 7 households in 12 years, she said. 7 families. I cared about all of them. I helped all of them. And every single one of them, everyone at some point, found a reason that I was no longer needed, or suitable, or... She stopped. I am not a woman who inspires permanence in people. I've made my peace with that. Samuel was quiet for a moment. Abigail, he said. Who told you that? She didn't answer. Because whoever told you that, he said, was a damn fool. The profanity so unexpected from a man who did not generally use it startled a short, involuntary, almost laugh out of her. She pressed her lips together. You listen to me, Samuel said with the quiet firmness of a patriarch who has recovered himself and intends to use that recovery for something specific. My son is not a man who does things without reason. He drove 30 miles to a general store and came home with a stranger because something in him recognized something in you. And I can tell you, I know my son that what he recognized has only gotten clearer every day you've been in this house. He held her gaze. Don't you run from that because you're afraid. Abigail held very still. I'm not afraid, she said. Then what are you? He asked. A long pause. Careful, she said finally. Careful is just afraid with better posture, Samuel said and picked up his coffee. Abigail turned back to the stove. She did not say anything else. Neither did he. But the 47th jar she sealed that afternoon. She sealed it with shaking hands, and she was grateful her back was to him, and she was grateful for the steam from the canning pot that made her eyes water so naturally that no one could have said for certain that anything else was happening. The reply from Hendricks came on a Friday, 12 days after the wire was sent. Caleb read it at the breakfast table. Samuel sat across from him. Abigail stood at the stove with her back half turned, not pretending she wasn't listening. Caleb looked up from the letter. He looked at his father. He says the cooperative credit is valid, he said. Full amount. 4 tons of emergency feed allocation available for pickup at the Gallatin Depot starting September 1st. Samuel let out a breath. He also says... Caleb paused. He read the line again. He says he was sorry to hear Clara had passed. He says he should have written years ago and didn't because he didn't know what to say. Caleb set the letter down. He says he's glad Samuel is well. The kitchen was very quiet. Samuel looked at his coffee cup. His jaw worked. Abigail turned from the stove and set a plate of biscuits on the table and went back to the stove and did not look at either of them because some moments belong only to the people they happen to. Well, Samuel said. Yeah, Caleb said. Another silence. The broker wrote too, Caleb said. He's interested in the southeast quarter easement, wants to meet next week. I'll go with you, Samuel said. Caleb looked at him. I know Reeves. Samuel said Reeves being the broker's name which was in the letter. We negotiated a water rights deal in 1878. He'll give us a better number if I'm in the room. Caleb held his father's gaze for a moment. There was a lot in that moment, 3 years of silence and absence, and the particular loneliness of a son who has been trying to hold together the thing his father built while his father was too far away to help. There was anger in it, and grief, and the complicated relief of someone who has been carrying alone and has just felt someone's hand on the other side of the load. All right, Caleb said. We go together. He picked up his coffee. Samuel picked up a biscuit. Outside, the morning was moving forward the way mornings do, indifferent to the magnitude of small kitchen conversations that change the entire direction of everything. Pete's boots crossed the yard. One of the horses called from the barn. Denny's whistle started up, then stopped, then started again, in a different key. And at the stove, Abigail stood with her hands wrapped around the handle of the coffee pot and her eyes on the window above the sink and tried very hard not to think about what Samuel had said. Careful is just afraid with better posture. She poured herself a cup. She sat down at the table. She was in the middle of reaching for a biscuit when Caleb looked up from his letter and caught her eye and said quietly and without any particular announcement, I don't know what we would have done without you. It was a simple sentence. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise or an offering of anything specific. It was just the plain truth spoken by a plain man who did not say things unless he meant them exactly. But it hit Abigail Harper somewhere below her sternum with the force of something she had not let herself feel in a very long time. And she held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. 2 seconds that were too long to be casual and not long enough to be a confession before she looked down at her plate and said, "Pass me one of those biscuits." He did. She ate it. And across the table, Samuel Mercer looked at his coffee cup and did not say "I told you so," because he was a man of some dignity. But he thought it. He definitely thought it. 2 days later, Caleb came in from the barn after dark and found the back porch light on, and Abigail sitting on the top step with a shawl around her shoulders and her face turned away. He almost said something cheerful about the evening air. Then he saw her shoulders. "Abigail," he said. She turned, and her face in the lamplight was composed or nearly composed. The kind of nearly that a person achieves right before someone calls their name at exactly the wrong moment. "I'm fine," she said immediately. He sat down on the step beside her, not close, just near. "You don't have to be," he said. She looked straight ahead at the dark yard. Her hands were in her lap, fingers locked together in the tight, controlled grip he had come to recognize as her version of holding herself in. "It's foolish," she said. "Tell me anyway." A long silence. Across the yard, the barn was a dark shape against a darker sky. Somewhere a night bird called once and went quiet. "I got a letter today," she said, "from the family I worked for in Billings before I came here, the widower who passed." She stopped. "His son is selling the house. He found some of my things that were left in storage. He wrote to ask if I wanted them sent, or if he should just dispose of them." She paused. "I wrote back and said dispose of them." Caleb waited. 7 years, she said. 7 years I spent in that man's house, in that family. His grandchildren called me Miss Abby. His daughter-in-law taught me to make her mother's pie crust. Her voice was even. Too even. And his son wrote me 3 lines on half a sheet of paper, asking what to do with a box of my belongings. Caleb didn't say anything. He understood that she didn't need him to. I know it's just a letter," she said. "I know." "It's not just a letter," he said. She looked at him. "It's 7 years," he said. "That's not a letter. That's a verdict." Something cracked open in her face for just a moment. Not all the way, not completely, but enough that he could see what was underneath the composure, which was a woman who had spent a very long time being essential to people who did not understand that essential and permanent were not the same word. "I keep doing this," she said quietly. "I keep finding people worth caring about, and then they lose you," he said. She blinked. "That's the right sentence," he said. "Not the other way around." Abigail looked at him for a long moment. She unclenched her hands in her lap. "Caleb Mercer," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. "You are unexpectedly difficult to be sensible around." The corner of his mouth moved. "I'll take that," he said. She looked back at the dark yard, but the set of her shoulders had changed. Not entirely, not dramatically, just enough. "Come inside," he said. "It's getting cold." She stood. He stood. She went inside first, which was the arrangement they had without having discussed it. She knew where things were and moved through the house with a sureness that was already its own kind of belonging. Caleb followed her in and latched the door. At the end of the hall, the light was still on under his father's door, which meant Samuel was awake, which meant Samuel had probably been listening, which Caleb chose not to think about. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about the sentence he'd said. That's the right sentence, not the other way around, and whether he'd meant it as straightforwardly as it had come out, or whether there had been something else in it that he wasn't quite ready to examine. He was, it turned out, not ready to examine it yet. But it sat with him in the dark, quiet and patient, the way important things do when they've decided to wait. Down the hall in the back bedroom, Abigail lay in the dark and thought about nothing in particular with great concentration and failed, and eventually fell into a sleep that was troubled, and then somewhere in the small hours became simply quiet. The ranch was still around them. The mountains were still outside. And 11 weeks from November 1st, with 4 tons of emergency feed coming from the Gallatin Valley, and a broker meeting on Tuesday and 46 jars of preserves on the cellar shelves, the Mercer Ranch was still standing. Still standing. Which was, for now, exactly enough. The meeting with Reeves went better than Caleb had expected, and worse than he'd hoped, which was about as honest an outcome as a man could ask for in November, when the ground was hardening and the bank was watching. Reeves was a broad, deliberate man who ran his brokerage out of a timber office in Ridgeline, with the kind of careful efficiency that came from 30 years of knowing exactly how much a desperate man would accept and exactly how little a fair man could offer. He had a gray mustache and small eyes that moved over documents the way a hawk moves over open ground. Patient, focused, nothing wasted. Samuel walked in first. Reeves looked up from his desk and went completely still for a moment. Then he stood. "Samuel Mercer," he said, and his voice had something in it, not quite surprise, but the quality of a man recalibrating rapidly. "I'll be damned." "Don't swear, Reeves," Samuel said. "You're too old for it to sound natural." He pulled out the chair across from the desk and sat down as if he'd been sitting in that chair every week for the past decade, which was the particular power of a man who has decided to come back to himself. "You know my son." Reeves looked at Caleb, who had come in behind his father and was still adjusting to the fact that watching Samuel walk into a room and occupy it was like watching a different man entirely from the one who had been sitting in a dark bedroom refusing meals 18 months ago. "We've met," Reeves said, and extended his hand. They shook. Reeves sat back down. The negotiation took 2 hours and covered the southeast quarter easement, the grazing rights, the structure of the repayment terms, and 3 separate points at which Reeves made an offer that Samuel declined with the calm, unruffled patience of a man who has done this 100 times and knows the other man will come back with something better in approximately 4 minutes. He was right each time. By the time they left, the easement was structured as a 5-year arrangement at a number that covered the banknote with enough left over to carry the operating costs through spring without touching the breeding stock. It was not a triumph. It was a survival, clean, functional, and honestly negotiated, which in Caleb's experience was about the best you could ask of any deal. On the drive back, Samuel sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the road ahead without speaking for a long while. "You did well in there," Caleb said. "I remembered how," Samuel said. He paused. "I was afraid I wouldn't." Caleb kept his eyes on the horses. "Did you think you had—" "I thought a lot of things when I was in that room," Samuel said. "Most of them were wrong. Grief will do that." He turned the brim of his hat in his hands once, then put it back on. "I thought the ranch would be better off without me trying to run it, that I'd done nothing but make things harder. That's not true." "I know that now," Samuel said. "I didn't know it then." He was quiet for a moment. "I needed someone to open a door and put food outside it. That's a humbling thing to need." Caleb didn't say anything. "She never made me feel humbled by it," Samuel said. "That's the thing. She just left the food, knocked 3 times, walked away. She gave me room to come back to myself without making it a performance." "Yeah," Caleb said. "She does that." Samuel looked at him sideways. "You're going to have to say something to her eventually." "I know," Caleb said. "Sooner is better than later," Samuel said. "Women like Abigail Harper don't wait forever. They've been disappointed too many times to wait forever." Caleb kept driving. The road climbed. The pines thickened on both sides and the air sharpened with the smell of coming cold. "I know," he said again. Samuel apparently decided that was sufficient for one conversation because he put his hat down over his eyes and slept the rest of the way home, which was a thing Caleb had not seen him do in years. Sleep easily in motion, like a man who is not afraid of where he'll be when he wakes up. Caleb drove the horses and said nothing, and thought about everything. Abigail had a pot of venison stew waiting when they got back, and fresh bread, and a look on her face when they came through the door, that she replaced very quickly with her usual composed expression, but not quite quickly enough. She had been watching for them. She had been worried, and she had not wanted either of them to know it, and Caleb had been living in the same house as her for long enough now to read the things she tried to cover. "Well," she said. "Deal's done," Caleb said. She let out a breath that she had been holding for approximately 7 hours. "Good," she said, and turned back to the stove with the energy of a woman redirecting herself very firmly towards something useful. "Sit down, both of you. You look like you drove through weather." "We drove through Reeves," Samuel said, hanging up his coat. "Which is worse?" "Samuel got him down 2 points on the interest," Caleb said. Abigail turned. She looked at Samuel. Samuel settled into his chair with the unhurried satisfaction of a man who has done a day's work he can be proud of. "Pass the bread," he said. Abigail passed the bread. She sat down. She looked at her bowl, and then at the table at Samuel eating, and Caleb pulling off his gloves, and Pete knocking on the back door asking if the stew was on, because the smell had crossed the entire yard, and something moved through her face so briefly that only someone who had been watching her carefully for 3 months would have caught it. Caleb caught it. He didn't say anything. He just made sure her bowl was full before he filled his own. November arrived without ceremony and settled over the Mercer Ranch like a familiar old coat, heavy cold at the edges but known. The banknote was paid in full on the 28th of October, 3 days early, because Samuel had insisted on the margin. He had driven into Ridgeline himself with Caleb beside him and handed the certified bank draft across Eleanor Hatch's counter. Eleanor being the postmistress, as well as the dry goods proprietor, and asked her to witness the transaction, which she had done with an expression of such transparent astonishment that Samuel had looked at her mildly and said, "Did you think we were done?" And Eleanor had said, No, of course not," in a voice that suggested she absolutely had. The word traveled around the valley in the efficient way that all significant information traveled in small communities where everyone knew everyone's approximate financial situation. By the following Sunday, 3 separate neighbors had found reasons to ride out to the Mercer Ranch, one with a gift of smoked meat, one with a bottle of good whiskey that he pressed into Caleb's hands with more feeling than the occasion strictly required, and one who was Ruth Colby, who came and sat in the kitchen with Abigail for 2 hours, and drank coffee, and talked about nothing in particular, and everything that mattered. "People were worried about you," Ruth said. She was a solid, practical woman of about 50, with the directness of someone who had never learned to approach a subject from the side. "About the ranch, I mean." "I know," Abigail said. "They were also saying things," Ruth said. "About you specifically. I want you to know I set several of those things straight." Abigail looked at her over her coffee cup. "What kinds of things?" Ruth put down her cup. "The kind that small-minded people say about women who don't fit the exact shape they've decided women ought to fit." She met Abigail's eyes directly. "You know what I mean." "I know what you mean," Abigail said. "Eleanor Hatch said it was inappropriate," Ruth said. "A woman of yours, she used the word condition." Her jaw tightened. "I told Eleanor that the only condition that mattered was the condition of the Mercer household before Abigail Harper arrived, and after, and that if she wanted to discuss conditions, she should start with the condition of her own store's flour barrel, which has been harboring weevils since September." Abigail stared at her. "I may have been a little direct," Ruth said composedly. "Ruth," Abigail said, and her voice came out slightly unsteady. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Ruth said, in an exact echo of what Samuel had said months earlier, which struck Abigail with the odd force of an unexpected symmetry. "Just keep making that venison stew. I heard about it from Pete Harlow, and I am not too proud to be jealous." Abigail laughed. It was a real laugh, not the polite, composed, almost laugh she sometimes produced, but the actual kind, the kind that came from somewhere, genuinely surprised. Ruth looked pleased with herself in the manner of a woman who has been trying to get exactly that result and knows she's succeeded. They drank the rest of the coffee and talked about Ruth's peach trees and the winter feed situation in the valley generally, and the preacher's wife's new bonnet. And it was, Abigail realized somewhere in the middle of the second cup, the kind of ordinary afternoon conversation between women that she had not had in, she thought about it, possibly years. The kind where you're not performing usefulness or managing someone else's comfort. You're just sitting across from another person who sees you and finds you worth sitting across from. She thought about that after Ruth left. She stood at the kitchen window and thought about it with the particular attention of someone cataloging something they've been told they couldn't have. Then she put her cup in the basin and started supper, because supper didn't make itself, and the feeling, whatever it was, would still be there later. The first snow came on a Thursday night in early November, soft and without announcement, and by Friday morning, the ranch was white and quiet in the particular way of the first snow before the world has adjusted to it. Caleb came down to find Abigail already at the stove with the fire built up and coffee on, and she had a look on her face that he took him a moment to identify because he hadn't seen it on her before. She was happy, not the careful, contained, almost happy she usually permitted herself. Actually happy, a brightness in her eyes and a looseness in the set of her mouth that came from something simple and unguarded. "You like the snow?" he said. She looked at him. "Ohio winters," she said. First snow always felt like the world was starting over. Like everything messy and complicated got covered up and you had a chance to be better at things. Caleb poured his coffee. "Did it work?" "Sometimes," she said. "Not always, but it felt like it might, and that was enough." He stood at the back window and looked at the yard, white and still, the barn dark against it, the fence's clean lines in the new fall. He had not thought about the first snow in years. He had been too busy dreading winter, the additional work of it, the cold, the isolation that the ranch's distance from town made complete. But looking at it this morning through the same window he always looked through, it looked different. It looked like something that had happened to a place worth being. He wasn't sure when that had changed. He had some ideas. "Samuel asked me something yesterday," Abigail said with her back to him, stirring the oatmeal. "What did he ask?" She was quiet for a moment. "He asked me if I had thought about what I wanted to do come spring." Caleb went still. "He said it matter-of-factly," she said. "The way he says everything. Just had I thought about it." "What did you say?" Caleb asked. Another pause, longer this time. "I said I hadn't decided yet." Caleb put his cup down on the counter. He turned to look at the back of her, the wide, solid set of her shoulders, the apron strings tied neatly at her back, the way she held herself with a self-possession that looked like certainty from the outside, and that he had come to understand after months of paying attention was something she had built deliberately over years of needing to look certain when she wasn't. "Abigail," he said. "Don't," she said immediately. "Don't say something because my answer made you feel like you should. That's not—" She stopped, set the spoon down. "I mean it, Caleb. I don't want to be kept out of kindness." He crossed the kitchen. He came around to the side of the stove where she was standing, and he did not touch her. That was not the kind of man he was to reach first, but he stood close enough that she had to turn and look at him. And when she did, her expression was doing the complicated thing it did when she was working very hard to hold something together that wanted to come apart. "I'm not a man who does things out of kindness," he said. "You know that." "I know," she said. "I do things because they're right," he said, "or because I can't figure out how not to." He held her gaze. "You being here is both of those things." She looked at him for a long moment. "I have $47 saved," she said. "I told you I'd put it toward supplies. I did. I have $4 and change left." "I know," he said. "You think I don't know every single thing you've put into this place. I'm not listing it to make a case," she said. "I'm listing it because you should understand that I have almost nothing to my name and nowhere definite to go, and that makes whatever you say right now complicated. Because I can't know for certain if I'm—" She stopped. Her jaw worked. I can't know if I'm the right choice, or just the choice that's here. The kitchen was very still. Outside, the snow was coming down again, lighter now, the kind that falls so gently you almost can't see it move. When I drove into Ridgeline that afternoon, Caleb said slowly, I wasn't looking for anyone. I had a list salt coffee rope. I came in, bought the things, and was walking back out the door when I saw you sitting on that step. He paused. There were 3 women in that store who could cook and clean and manage a house. I didn't speak to any of them. I walked past all of them, and I spoke to you. He looked at her steadily. That wasn't obligation. That wasn't charity. I don't know exactly what it was, but it has gotten a lot clearer over the last 4 months, and I think you know what I'm saying? Abigail looked at him. Her hands were at her sides. She had stopped holding them together in the careful, controlled grip. They were just there, open. I'm not a small woman, she said. I know that, he said. I mean, she stopped. People have said things about the way I look, about why a man would... People have said things about everything I've ever done, Caleb said. I hired a woman nobody wanted. My father came back to his table. My ranch is still standing. And the woman standing in my kitchen right now is the reason for all 3 of those things. He paused. I don't need the town of Ridgeline to tell me what I'm looking at. Something gave way in her face. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. Caleb, she said, I'm asking you to stay, he said. Not as the housekeeper, not as the cook. I'm asking you to stay because this house is yours as much as mine, and I think you know it is, and I think you've been trying very hard not to let yourself know it. She looked at him for what felt like a long time. Then she said, I'm afraid. Yeah, he said. Me too. Another silence. The snow outside. The warm kitchen. The oatmeal going cold on the stove behind her, which neither of them was thinking about at all. All right, she said quietly. He looked at her. All right, you'll stay. All right, I'll stay, she said. And all right, I'm terrified. And all right, I think you should know that I have been in love with this family since approximately the 3rd week of July, and I have been arguing with myself about it ever since. Caleb looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. Then the rest of it. It was the most she had ever seen him smile, and it transformed his face into something she had not seen before. Younger, lighter, the lines that grief had put there still present, but no longer the whole story. 3rd week of July, he said. The night your father ate supper at the table, she said. I was washing dishes, and you came in from outside, and you looked at his empty chair, and you didn't say anything. You just looked at it, and I knew exactly what that meant. She paused. I was done for after that. Caleb reached out and put his hand over hers on the counter. Not holding it, just covering it. The way you cover something you want to be careful with. Samuel's going to be insufferable about this, he said. He already is, Abigail said. He's been insufferable about it for weeks. Caleb laughed. She had not heard him laugh before, not a real one, and it was a good sound lower than she'd expected and completely unguarded in the way of things that have been kept inside too long and are relieved to come out. He squeezed her hand once and then stepped back and picked up his coffee cup. Oatmeal's burning, he said. It is not, she said, turning back to the stove with the flushed, working to be composed energy of a woman who is feeling too many things to be fully functional. She stirred it. It's fine. It's definitely burning a little, he said. Get out of my kitchen, she said. Yes, ma'am, he said, and took his coffee and went, and she heard him in the hallway a moment later saying, Morning, Dad. And Samuel's reply, which she couldn't quite make out, and then the sound of Caleb's boots going toward the front room, and Samuel's slow, deliberate steps coming toward the kitchen. Samuel appeared in the doorway. He looked at Abigail. He looked at the oatmeal. He looked at Abigail again, specifically at whatever her face was doing. Well, he said. Don't, she said. I wasn't going to say anything, he said. You were absolutely going to say something, she said. He sat down at the table with the profound innocence of a man who has won an argument that technically never happened. "Is there cinnamon in the oatmeal?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. She put the bowl in front of him. He picked up his spoon. "Abigail," he said. She looked at him. "Clara would be very happy," he said. "Just so you know." She turned back to the stove because she needed something to look at that wasn't Samuel Mercer's face, which was doing something she had never seen it do before. Something open and genuine and free of the careful flatness he usually maintained over his emotions. "Eat your oatmeal," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, in an exact echo of his son, and she pressed her lips together and absolutely did not smile. She did smile, but only once she was facing the stove. Christmas at the Mercer Ranch was, by the objective accounting of everyone present, unlike any Christmas the property had seen in years. This was due partly to the fact that Samuel Mercer was at the table, and had been at the table for months now, and had decided with the returning authority of a man who has rediscovered that he still has opinions that Christmas would be done properly. It was due partly to Pete, Denny, and Walt, who had nowhere else to be, and had accepted Abigail's invitation with a speed that suggested they had been hoping it was coming. It was due largely to Abigail herself, who had been putting things up and planning and calculating since the first week of December, with the focused, strategic energy she brought to everything she decided mattered. Ruth Colby came with her husband Thomas, who was a quiet, bearded man that Abigail liked immediately for his habit of saying exactly what he thought in the fewest possible words. The preacher and his wife came. A neighboring family, the Daltons from the East Slope, who had 3 children under 10, came, and the children immediately claimed the front room as their territory, and had to be periodically retrieved from increasingly improbable locations. Samuel taught Abigail a card game that had been in the Mercer family since his own grandfather's time. He taught her with the patient exactness of a man who takes games seriously and fully expects his opponent to take them seriously too. And when she won the 3rd hand in a row, he looked at her with pure indignant suspicion and said, "Did you already know this game?" "I've never played it in my life," she said. He said, and dealt again. Caleb watched this from across the table with the expression of a man who is containing a significant amount of private entertainment. Pete caught his eye and raised his cup. Caleb raised his back. Denny, who had received a second letter from his mother in Kansas, a longer one this time, 3 full pages, in her careful hand, read it in the corner of the front room with the Dalton children periodically climbing on him, and appeared to be working something out in his expression that was going to require time and distance to fully resolve. Walt, who observed all of this from his chair by the fire, with the composed attention of a man who has outlasted most things, said to no one in particular, "Good Christmas." This was the longest sentence he had produced in 3 weeks, and everyone treated it with the respect it deserved. Abigail sat at the table with Samuel's card game spread between them, and the sounds of a house full of people around her, and felt for the first time in longer than she could precisely identify that the warmth she was inside was not borrowed. She had been careful for so long, so deliberate about the distance she kept from things that could be taken away. She had been so practiced at not belonging to places that belonging had started to feel like something other people did, a skill she'd been watching from outside the window. But here was Samuel slamming his cards on the table because she'd just taken the trick again and saying, "That is not possible without cheating." And here was Caleb across the room telling one of the Dalton children to please not climb the bookcase. And here was Pete laughing at something Walt had just said, with a warmth that had everything to do with where they were and who they were sitting with. Here it was. The thing she'd been not falling in love with for months. She looked up from her cards. Caleb was looking at her from across the room. When their eyes met, he didn't look away. He just looked at her, the way he'd been looking at her for weeks now, steady, clear, without apology, until she felt the color come up in her face, and she looked back at her cards. "You're blushing," Samuel said. "I am not," she said. "You absolutely are," he said with deep satisfaction. "Deal." She dealt. She was definitely blushing. 2 days after Christmas, the gossip that Abigail had been peripherally aware of since October arrived at the front door in the specific form of a woman named Harriet Grove, who was the wife of the man who owned the lumber mill on the south edge of Ridgeline, and who had appointed herself, in the absence of any competing candidate, the social conscience of the entire valley. Harriet knocked. Caleb answered the door. "Mr. Mercer," Harriet said, "I've come to call." He let her in because there was no graceful alternative, and because Abigail, who had been in the kitchen and heard the knock, appeared in the hallway with the composed expression of a woman who knows exactly who has arrived and has already decided how she intends to handle it. Harriet looked at Abigail. Her gaze moved over her the way it always had, with the particular quality of assessment that encoded its conclusion before the assessment was complete. Abigail had seen this look her entire life. She had learned every variation of it. She knew this one. "Miss Harper," Harriet said, "I'll speak plainly." "Please do," Abigail said. "There is talk in the valley," Harriet said, "about the arrangement here. A single woman on a bachelor ranch with no formal standing. People are concerned about propriety." "Which people?" Caleb said. Harriet looked at him. "People of standing in this community." "Name one," he said. Harriet drew herself up. "Mr. Mercer, I don't think—" "I ask," Caleb said, with the flat, patient quality of a man who will not be moved because Abigail Harper has been in this valley since July. In that time, she has been visited by Ruth Colby, the Dalton family, Reverend Pierce and his wife, 4 of my neighbors who wanted to introduce themselves properly, and half a dozen people who came to the Christmas gathering I hosted last week." He paused. "I don't know who these people of standing are that you're speaking for, but they don't appear to be the people who've actually met her." Harriet's face moved through several positions. "Furthermore," said a voice from the hallway, and Samuel Mercer appeared from the direction of his room, walking with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has made a decision about where he's going and doesn't need to rush to prove it. "Abigail Harper is not a stranger on this property. She is family." He stopped beside Caleb and looked at Harriet directly. "And if the valley has concerns about what goes on inside the walls of my family's home, the valley is welcome to come discuss those concerns with me directly. My door is open." Harriet looked at him. Samuel looked back at her without blinking. "Pretty faces," Samuel said, which was not a non sequitur. Abigail knew immediately what he was doing. Don't rebuild broken homes. Kind hearts do. He held Harriet's gaze. "My home was broken. It's not anymore. You can draw your own conclusions about why." The room was very quiet. Harriet looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at her. Harriet looked at Abigail. Abigail met her eyes with the steadiness of a woman who has been looked at this way many times and has decided somewhere along the line that she will not be the one to look away first. "I see," Harriet said finally. "Well." She picked up her gloves from where she'd set them on the entry table. "I'm glad the family is well." "Thank you for calling," Abigail said. Her voice was entirely even. Harriet left. The door closed. The 3 of them stood in the entry hall, Samuel, Caleb, and Abigail, and the silence that followed Harriet's departure had a distinctly different quality from the silence that had preceded her arrival. Samuel said, "That woman has been a trial to this valley since 1879. "Samuel," Abigail said, and her voice was not entirely steady. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her for a moment, with the expression he saved for things he found important, but didn't intend to make into speeches. Then he said, "Don't thank me," which was, she had come to understand, his version of, "You're welcome." He turned and went back toward the kitchen. "Is there coffee?" "On the stove," she said. He went. Caleb stood beside her in the entry hall. "You all right?" he said. She thought about it for a moment, the real answer, not the reflexive one. She thought about Harriet's look, which she had absorbed and held and would hold for a while, the way you hold something that bruises. She thought about Samuel standing in the hallway, saying family with the unequivocal declarative weight of a man who meant it as a fact and not as a courtesy. "Yes," she said. "I am." And it was true. Not perfectly. Not without the residue of a look she'd been seeing her whole life. But true underneath all of that, in the place where the things that actually sustain you live. She was all right. Caleb reached out and took her hand. Not carefully this time. Just directly, his whole hand around hers, the way you hold on to something you've decided you're not going to be careful about anymore, because being careful about it is just another way of not trusting it. "Come have coffee," he said. "Yes," she said. They went to the kitchen. Samuel was at the head of the table with his cup. He looked up when they came in. He looked at their hands. He looked at his coffee. "About time," he said to no one in particular, in the tone of a man who has been waiting on a very slow train and drank. Samuel Mercer got on a horse in the second week of January. Nobody asked him to. Nobody suggested it. He simply appeared at the barn one morning while Caleb was putting up the feed, dressed in his old work coat with his good boots on, and stood at the stall of the gray gelding he had ridden for 15 years, and ran his hand down the horse's neck with the slow, deliberate tenderness of a man reacquainting himself with something he'd been afraid to miss. Pete Harlow, who was mending a harness in the corner of the barn, looked up and then looked very carefully back down at the harness. "He remember me, you think?" Samuel said. "Gray's a smart horse," Caleb said from the next stall. "He remembers." Samuel put his foot in the stirrup. He pulled himself up with the effort of a man whose body has been still too long and whose pride will not allow him to show how much that stillness has cost him. He settled into the saddle. The gray shifted once adjusted and went still beneath him. Samuel sat on that horse in the middle of the barn and did not speak for a moment. Then he said, "All right," very quietly, to the horse or to himself or to some third thing that only he could see. He walked the gray out of the barn and into the January cold, and rode out toward the north field at a slow, easy pace, and Caleb stood in the barn door and watched him go, and did not say a single word, because there were no words adequate to what he was watching, and he knew it. Pete set down the harness. "Lord Almighty," he said softly. "Yeah," Caleb said. At breakfast that morning, Abigail had put Samuel's oatmeal on the table at 7:30, as she always did, and at 7:45, when he still hadn't come in, she'd gone looking for him. Caleb had told her where he was. She'd stood at the kitchen window and watched the gray gelding and the old man on his back moving through the pale winter light across the near field, and she'd held on to the edge of the sink with both hands and breathed very carefully until she was sure she was going to be able to conduct herself properly. She was getting better at letting things matter without being undone by them. She was not yet perfect at it. She went back to the stove. Samuel's oatmeal was cold by the time he came in, and she reheated it without comment, and he ate it without comment, and neither of them mentioned the horse or the field or the 15 minutes she'd spent at the kitchen window. They didn't need to. That was one of the things Abigail had come to understand about the Mercer household, that the most important moments often happened in perfect silence, and were understood completely anyway. "Good morning was cold," Samuel said over his second cup of coffee. "It was," she agreed. "Going to be a hard January." "Probably." He turned his cup. "I rode out to the east fence line," he said in the elaborately casual tone of a man reporting an unremarkable errand. "It needs attention come spring." "I'll tell Caleb," she said. "I'll tell him myself," Samuel said. "It's my fence." Abigail looked at him over her own cup. He met her eyes with the expression of a man who knows exactly what he just said and exactly what it means. His fence, his ranch, his world returned to him, claimed back, inhabited again, with the full authority of a man who belongs to a place and has decided to act like it. "Yes," she said, "it is." He drank his coffee. She drank hers. Outside somewhere in the direction of the north field, the gray gelding's hoof prints were pressed clean and clear into the January snow, and they would melt in a few days when the temperature lifted. But for now, they were there, evidence of a thing that had happened that could not be unhappened. January deepened, and then slowly, reluctantly, began to release its grip. The days lengthened by minutes, at first barely perceptible, the kind of change you only notice if you've been paying attention. Abigail had been paying attention. She had been paying attention to everything since July, in the careful, thorough way of a woman who understands that the life she is living is not guaranteed and therefore should be witnessed properly while it's happening. She wrote things down, not a diary exactly. She was not a woman given to ceremony about private thoughts, but notes in the back of Clara's recipe book, in the margins, where there was space. Small things. The day Samuel rode out to the fence line. The night Denny read his mother's letter aloud at supper, his voice going uncertain in the middle of the second paragraph, and how everyone at the table had looked at their plates with the careful respect of people who understand that a young man reading his mother's words needs the dignity of not being watched. The way Caleb had said her name that morning in December before the snow, the first time, the way it had sounded different from every other time anyone had ever said it. She wrote them in the margins in her small, even hand because she wanted proof. She had spent so many years moving through other people's lives without leaving a mark of her own that she had developed a habit of needing some record that she had been somewhere, that something had mattered to her, that she had been a person in a place and not just a function. Caleb found her at the kitchen table one evening in February, the recipe book open in front of her, pen in hand. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Writing," she said. She closed the book before he could see, then caught herself and opened it again, because closing it had been the old reflex, the one that hid the things that might give too much away, and she was trying to be done with that. "Notes," she said, "in the margins of your mother's book." He sat down across from her. She turned the book toward him. He looked at the page, Clara's recipe for apple preserves, and in the margin alongside it, in different ink and different handwriting, Abigail's notes. November 3rd, Samuel rode to the east fence. November 12th, first hard frost. Denny got a letter. Walt fixed the barn roof alone because he didn't want to ask for help, and Pete let him, which was the right thing. December 8th, first snow. C said this house is mine as much as his. I didn't argue. Caleb read it. He looked up. "You've been keeping a record," he said. "I needed to," she said. "I needed to know these things happened, that I was here when they happened." He looked at her steadily. "You're always going to be here when things happen," he said. "You know that, don't you?" She looked at him. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, "and neither are you. Not because I need you to stay. Because this is where you live now." Abigail held the moment with both hands, the way she'd learned to hold good things firmly enough that they were real, carefully enough that they didn't break. "Yes," she said, "it is." He pushed the book back toward her. "Keep writing in it," he said. Clara would have liked knowing the book was still being used. She looked at him for a moment with an expression she didn't try to compose. She just let it be there. "Yes," she said quietly. She would have. The proposal when it came was not the sort that would have satisfied anyone looking for ceremony. It was Caleb, which meant it was plain and direct, and exactly what it was, with nothing added for effect. And it happened on a Tuesday evening in March, when the snow was pulling back from the south-facing slopes, and the kitchen garden was showing its first tentative suggestions of green at the edges. He came in from the barn at dusk, and found Abigail sitting on the back step in the last of the evening light, with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, and her face turned toward the mountains, the way she sometimes turned toward them when she was thinking something through. He had learned to recognize this posture. He had also learned not to interrupt it, which was one of the more significant things he had learned in the past 9 months. He sat down beside her. She handed him the tea without looking away from the mountains. He drank it. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" she said. "Spring's coming," he said. "I know," she said. "Place is going to need a lot of work. East fence. The west barn roof where it came through in January. Replanting the kitchen garden. The breeding stock's going to need attention." "I know," she said again. "Could use another pair of hands," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains. "Caleb Mercer," she said. "I'm getting to it," he said. "I'm not a man who talks fast." "I know you're not," she said. "I've been thinking about the cottonwood trees," he said, "on the south fence line. My grandmother planted them. My mother used to sit under them in the summer." He paused. "They're going to be full out in May. They look right in May." She looked at him. He looked back at her. "I would like, He said to get married under those trees in May, if you're willing. The evening air was very still. Abigail Harper looked at this man, this plain, particular, entirely unromantic man, who had driven 30 miles to a general store and come home with a stranger, and changed the entire direction of both their lives. And she felt the specific emotion that comes from having wanted something so much and so quietly for so long, that when it arrives in plain language on a Tuesday evening, it hits you with the force of something you'd stopped letting yourself believe in. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. "All right," he said. She looked back at the mountains. He sat beside her. After a moment she said, "That was the least romantic proposal in the history of Montana." "Probably," he said. "You didn't even ask a question," she said. "You just said if you're willing." "You said yes," he pointed out. She pressed her lips together. "I did," she said. He took the empty teacup out of her hands and set it on the step beside him. And then he took her hand the way he'd been taking it since December, directly without ceremony. And they sat on the back step while the light went out of the sky and the mountains went dark, and the first stars came out over the Gallatin Ridge. Inside, a chair scraped the kitchen floor. Neither of them said anything. "He was listening," Caleb said. "He's always listening," Abigail said. The kitchen door opened. Samuel appeared. He had 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to each of them with the elaborate innocence of a man who has absolutely not been standing on the other side of that door for the last 5 minutes. "Cold evening," he said. "It is," Caleb said. Samuel looked at Abigail's hand in Caleb's. He looked back at the yard. "May's a good month for a wedding," he said. "Samuel," Caleb said. "I'm going inside," Samuel said. "It's cold." He went inside. The door closed. Through the kitchen window they could see the lamp and his shape moving back toward his chair at the table. Abigail started laughing. Really laughing, the unself-conscious, fully released kind that she had been letting out more often since December, and that Caleb had come to think of as the best sound he knew, better than any other sound the ranch made, better than anything he'd found words for. He put his arm around her shoulders, which was something new, the ease of it, the natural, unannounced ease, and she leaned into him with the equally natural ease of a woman who has finally, after a very long time, stopped arguing with belonging. They sat on the step. The stars came out. Inside, Samuel Mercer drank his coffee at the head of his table and was, for the first time in years, exactly where he was supposed to be. Spring came the way it always came to the Gallatin Ridge, in fits and arguments. Warm days followed by cold snaps that made the cattle restless and the mud deep, and the temperament of everyone on the property approximately 20% shorter than usual. Abigail had been through a Montana winter now, and she understood things she hadn't understood in July, the specific misery of February, the particular relief of March, the cautious, hard-won joy of April, when the ground softened and the first real warmth came into the air, and the kitchen garden showed actual color instead of suggestions of it. She planted the garden in the last week of April, kneeling in the turned earth with her sleeves rolled to the elbows, the way she always worked when there was real work to do. Ruth Colby came and helped for 2 days, which was Ruth's way of celebrating the engagement. She did not make a fuss about things. She showed up and worked alongside you, which Abigail had come to understand was the highest expression of friendship Ruth knew how to offer, and was therefore exactly right. "The whole valley's talking," Ruth said on the second morning, patting soil around a tomato, start with the efficient precision of a woman who had been growing things in mountain ground for 30 years. "About the wedding," Abigail said. "About everything," Ruth said. "About how Samuel's riding again. About how Caleb Mercer, who has not shown up to a community event in 3 years, came to the spring meeting last week and bought a round of drinks for the whole room." She paused. "About you. What about me?" Abigail said. Ruth looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated clarity she brought to everything. "About how a woman nobody wanted to hire in July turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to the best family in this valley," she said. "That's what they're saying. Even Eleanor Hatch." Abigail sat back on her heels. "Eleanor said that," she said. "Eleanor said, and I am quoting accurately, that she may have been hasty in her initial assessment, Ruth said. For Eleanor, that is a full and unconditional apology. Abigail looked at the garden row in front of her and thought about Eleanor Hatch's face the morning Caleb had told her about Samuel eating at the table. She thought about the long, careful architecture of small-minded things that had been said about her since July in the store in the street, in the rooms she hadn't been in, but that she'd felt the effects of nonetheless. She thought about Harriet Grove's visit and Samuel's voice in the hallway saying family. She thought about all of it. "I don't need Eleanor Hatch's good opinion," she said. "No," Ruth agreed. "But it's there anyway, which proves the point." Abigail smiled. She picked up the next tomato start. "What point?" she said. "That the truth wins eventually," Ruth said. "It's slow. It's annoying. It takes entirely too long. But it wins." They planted the rest of the row in comfortable silence. The morning of the wedding was the 19th of May, and the cottonwood trees on the south fence line were exactly as Caleb had said they would be, full out the new leaves, that particular shade of bright clear green that only exists for a few weeks in spring, and that makes you feel, if you're paying attention, that you are witnessing something that the world made specifically for this moment. Abigail stood inside the house at the kitchen window and looked at those trees and thought about a woman named Clara Mercer who had planted them 40 years ago, and written her recipes in a careful hand, and said that if the chicken was right, the cook was honest, and whose house this had been before it was anyone else's, and was now, by some series of decisions that Abigail had not planned and would not have dared to hope for, hers as well. She pressed her hand flat against the window glass. "She knows," Samuel said from behind her. She turned. He was standing in the kitchen doorway in his good suit, which he had gotten out and pressed himself the night before, with the methodical care of a man who understands that some occasions require the formal version of yourself. He looked like the man he must have been before, upright, substantial, fully present in his own skin. "You think so?" she said. "I know so," he said. "Clara always knew what was happening in this house, even from that far off." He paused. "She'd have a lot to say. She always had a lot to say." The corner of his mouth moved. "I miss that more than I can tell you." Abigail walked across the kitchen and stood in front of him. She was wearing the blue dress she'd made from the fabric Ruth had brought her in April. Good wool, deep blue, the kind of color that had no apology in it. Her hair was pinned up in a way she had not worn it before, and she was not small, and she was not what the town of Ridgeline had decided she ought to be, and she was not any version of herself that had been shaped by the long catalog of dismissals and assessments and sideways looks that she had carried since childhood. She was exactly herself. She held out her arm. Samuel took it. They walked out through the kitchen door and across the yard and through the south gate to where the cottonwood trees stood in the May morning, and everyone they loved was already there. Pete and Denny and Walt, in their clean clothes, looking simultaneously proud and mildly terrified, in the way of men not accustomed to formal occasions, the Dalton family with their children, who had been strictly instructed to behave and were largely complying. Ruth and Thomas Colby, the Reverend Pierce with his wife. A handful of neighbors who had come because the news of this wedding had traveled in the particular way of things the valley had decided to celebrate rather than dissect. Caleb was standing under the cottonwood trees. He had his good hat and his clean jacket and his hands at his sides, and he was watching her come across the yard with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Entirely open, entirely unguarded. The face of a man who has decided that being careful with his feelings is a luxury he no longer needs, because the person he's feeling them about already knows. He took one step forward when she reached him. Samuel put her hand in Caleb's. He held her hand. He looked at her. "You look right," he said quietly, which was the Mercer family version of something vast and important, and she knew it, and she felt it go all the way through her. Reverend Pierce was efficient and kind, and did not make the ceremony longer than it needed to be. He spoke about partnership and steadfastness and the specific grace of two people choosing each other on ordinary Tuesday evenings, as well as on days with cottonwood trees and May light. And Abigail thought that he had, without knowing it exactly, described what had happened. They said what needed to be said. They were married. Pete let out a sound that was supposed to be a controlled expression of approval and came out instead as something close to a shout, which startled one of the Dalton children into laughing, which set the other two off, which broke the formality entirely and let the morning become what it actually was. A collection of people standing in the grass under the cottonwood trees, happy in the uncomplicated and complete way of people who are exactly where they belong. Samuel shook his son's hand. Then he turned to Abigail. He looked at her for a moment. Then he put both arms around her and held on, which was more than she had expected from a man who did not generally make his feelings into public performances. And she held on back, and nobody said anything, and it was sufficient. Summer returned to the Gallatin Ridge as it always had, as it always would, big and warm, and indifferent to the small human dramas conducted under its sky, which was one of the things Abigail had come to love about it. The mountains did not care about Harriet Grove. The July heat did not adjust itself based on the opinions of Eleanor Hatch. The kitchen garden grew because seeds were planted and soil was tended and water was given, and the cattle grazed because the grass came back after the drought, the way grass always comes back stubborn and green and without asking permission. The Mercer Ranch ran the summer with the organized, purposeful energy of a place that has found its rhythm again. Pete ran the North Herd with the authority of a man who has been given more responsibility than he was originally hired for, and has grown into it like a good boot. Walt fixed things. Denny, who had written to his mother again and again, and who had received in return a steady correspondence that had visibly changed the quality of his days, worked with a settled happiness that made him better at everything he did. Samuel oversaw the finances with the systematic attention of a man who has recovered his purpose and will not waste it again. He wrote letters, attended the cooperative meetings, negotiated the things that needed negotiating, and came home in the evenings and sat at the head of his table and ate his supper and was by every observable measure himself. Caleb was Caleb, the same man who had driven 30 miles to a general store on an ordinary afternoon in the summer of 1887 with a list that said salt coffee rope and had come home with Abigail Harper, which was the best mistake he had never made. He said that to her once in July, almost exactly a year from the afternoon, she had sat on the general store porch with her iron skillet in her lap and not begged. "Best mistake I never made," he said. They were sitting on the back step, which had become the place where they sat in the evenings, when the work was done and the house was quiet, and there was nothing left to do but be in the same place at the same time, which was, Abigail had come to understand the whole of what home actually meant. "You didn't make a mistake," she said. "Exactly," he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the infuriating calm of a man who is pleased with himself and knows it. "That doesn't make any sense," she said. "It makes complete sense," he said. "I made the right call. The best right call I ever made. The best unmistake in the history of the Mercer Ranch." "You are the least poetic man in the state of Montana," she said. "I married the most practical woman in the state of Montana," he said. "We balance out." She looked at the mountains. She looked at her hands. She thought about the iron skillet she had set on her knees on a porch in Ridgeline, and the cold calculation of a woman who had been turned away 4 times in 6 days, and had decided with the particular stubbornness of someone who has nothing left to lose, that she would cook her own supper on the side of the road before she would beg. She thought about the sound of 3 soft knocks and the empty tray on the floor of a hallway. She thought about Samuel's face the first morning he walked into the kitchen, about Pete's voice saying, "We ain't going anywhere," about Ruth Colby arriving with 2 bushels of peaches because she'd heard there was trouble and she'd figured they could use them, about Denny's voice going uncertain in the middle of his mother's letter. She thought about the way Caleb had looked at her on the morning of the wedding under the cottonwood trees and said, "You look right," and the way those words had been exactly enough. And then she stopped thinking and simply sat on the back step in the July evening beside the man who had, without intending to, and without ceremony, and without any particular claim to heroism, given her a chance which was all she had ever needed, all any person ever needs, which is one door left open by one person who has decided that what they see is worth more than what everyone else said. Travelers moving through the Gallatin Valley that summer, and the summers that followed, often stopped at the Mercer Ranch. The reputation of the place traveled in the way that genuine things travel, not through announcement, but through the accounts of people who had actually been there, who had eaten at the table, or sat on the porch, or been helped in some small practical way by a woman who did not distinguish between strangers worth helping and strangers not worth it. People came needing directions and left with dinner. People came with sick animals and found Walt already reaching for the kit. People came having heard some version of the story: the woman on the porch, the empty tray, the old man who came back to his table and found themselves welcomed into a kitchen that smelled like bread and coffee and something harder to name, which was the specific atmosphere of a house that has been put back together by people who understood that the work of rebuilding is never a single dramatic act, but 10,000 small ones, patient and daily, and unremarkable from the outside and everything from within. Some people said Caleb Mercer had rescued a woman nobody wanted. They had the story backwards. He had offered her a job. She had saved his father. She had restored his house. She had rebuilt the future of a family that had been sitting at the edge of its own ending and had not known it. And in return, not as payment, not as transaction, but in the way that genuine things move between people who have chosen each other, she had been given the one thing she had spent 12 years and 7 households, and every early morning in every dark back bedroom talking herself out of wanting. A place that was hers, not borrowed, not temporary, not contingent on her usefulness or her size or the opinions of women who assessed her from doorways. Not held out at arm's length and taken back when the need for her passed. Hers. The Mercer kitchen. The cottonwood trees on the south fence. The recipe book with Clara's careful writing, and her own notes pressed into the margins, 2 women's handwriting in the same book. The older one teaching the newer one, learning both of them belonging to the same place across the distance of years. The table where Samuel sat at the head and told the truth in plain language. The back step where the mountains were always exactly there. The man who had looked at her on a porch in Ridgeline and seen past everything the town had decided she was the thing she actually was, which was a woman worth driving home. Healing never began with miracles. Abigail Harper had known that her whole life, had lived it kitchen by kitchen and family by family, had proved it every morning with a tray and 3 soft knocks and the patience to walk away and let the door open on its own time. It began with a meal left outside a closed door. It began with a curtain hung back on its hook. It began with one person choosing to stay when everything in their history said leave, and another person choosing to open the door wider than they had opened it in years, and an old man at a table deciding that the world still had something left in it worth coming back for. It began with ordinary hands doing ordinary work. It began exactly like this, and it lasted.